Alright, so the next operation is going to be to hinge the elevators onto the stabilizer. What we're going to do is we're going to first make sure that the elevator is correct side to side, because it can slide a little bit right to left. We want to make sure this gap right here is equal in size to this gap right here, and in this case I need to slide it just a little bit to the right and equalize those gaps. Okay, and then what we want to do is the same thing we did on the rudder. Remember, on the rudder, to set the hinge gap, we swung it side to side 45 degrees. Same thing here. We're going to push this forward until it contacts the stabilizer. Then we're going to flex it up 45 degrees. Okay, and that's going to set our hinge gap. Okay, we now have the correct hinge gap. Alright, now if you make your hinge gap too large, you can run into a problem, but it's easy to fix. It's possible, if you made your hinge gap extremely large, that you might get interference between the elevator phenolic fiberglass joiner and the fuselage. So if you ever happen to get a little interference in that joint, all we're going to do is we're going to take a hobby knife and we'll just remove a little bit of wood here at the back as necessary. Very easy to do, but if you set your hinge gap correctly, you shouldn't have any problems with that. As you can see, we can swing ours 45 degrees and we have plenty of clearance for our phenolic elevator joiner. So we've got our hinge gap set. So just like on the rudder, the next operation is to put a couple of drops of thin CA glue onto each hinge. Okay. I've got a little excess on the covering, so I'm just going to wipe it off. If I get any streaking, I can come back with my debonder and fix that later. And we're going to let this dry. 45 degrees up and 45 degrees down, and about 45 left and about 45 right are common high rate throws for 3D aircraft. 45 degrees on the elevator is enough to stall both wings on the airplane at the same time, so that the airplane will fly past stall straight ahead. And so we want to achieve 45 degrees of up and 45 degrees of down throw when we're setting up our airplane. Now, if you don't know what 45 degrees looks like, here's a real simple way to do it. Take a sheet of rectangular paper and just fold it over like that. Okay? That angle right there, that's 45 degrees, and you can use that if you need to as a quick setup device to find 45 degrees. Okay, so 45 degrees, easiest way to find it. Alright, now we're going to go on to assembling the front end of the aircraft. We're going to start our equipment install, and we're going to do our servos and our tail wheel. Okay, so we're going to do the tail wheel installation on our edge. And this piece right here, this is your tail wheel support bracket. You have to round the tail wheel support bracket. This prevents the tail wheel from tearing the rudder off the airplane in case you ever land on it hard or get it stuck in a hole. But this is the same tail wheel bracket that we use on all of our aircraft up to 48 inches in wingspan. It's over-designed for the little edge. It's much larger than we need. So one little weight-saving trick that we can do is take some pliers or some cutters, and we can just cut this guy in half. And you see right there the little cut line I made? And we're just going to break this off. This is not a necessary step, but people always ask, how do I lighten my plane up a little bit? Well, this is a good way to do it. That's a couple of grams that's not doing you any good. So you can cut it down like that if you like, or you can install it with both screws and the full bracket. Doesn't matter, but if you want to do a little bit of lightening, that's a good way to do it. The tail wheel wire fits onto the tail wheel bracket like that. This is how it's going to operate in the airplane. This is the piece that's going to be in the rudder. The bracket's going to be screwed onto the fuselage, and it twists like that. So we're going to install all these pieces now. On the bottom of the rudder, and when you do this, you'll feel the slot, which is pre-made in the bottom of the rudder to hold the tail wheel wire. Okay. So we'll peel this covering out of the way. There we go. And there's the slot. We want to take our wire, we want to hold it up to the rudder and figure out where we need to make our hole for the wire to fit into. Okay? So we're going to get all the covering out of the way. And we're just going to use the wire, make a little hole, and we're going to push the tail wheel wire into the bottom of the rudder. Now, the front of the tail wheel wire needs to be in line with the hinge line of the rudder itself. Okay? If it's not in line with it, it'll cause drag. That's one of the biggest problems that people have on 3D aircraft, is they get a rudder that's sticky and it won't move, and they can't figure out why. Well, if they take their tail wheel off, suddenly everything moves perfectly fine. It's because the tail wheel wire is not lined up with the hinge line of the rudder. It's too far back or too far forward. So we're going to take our time with this, and we're going to make sure that when we install our tail wheel, that the tail wheel wire is exactly in line with the hinge line, and this is how it should look. Okay? We have our tail wheel wire where it fits into the bottom of the rudder. The front of it lines up perfectly with the hinge line here in the front of the rudder, and you can see it's right on the hinge line. Okay? So here's how we're going to do our installation. We're going to pull the wire back out. We're going to use epoxy glue. Again, I'm using the very nice 3M epoxy gun, but a toothpick or a matchstick or a popsicle stick and 5-minute epoxy will work just as well. We're going to put the tail wheel wire in place. A little bit of epoxy is going to squeeze out. We're going to take our alcohol soaked rag and we're going to get rid of any excess epoxy, just like we did before. And now we're going to let this assembly dry. And when it's dried, the tail wheel wire will be part of the rudder, and when we pivot the rudder, the tail wheel wire will rotate perfectly on the hinge line, just like that. Our epoxy has dried. Our tail wheel wire is now part of the rudder. So we're going to slip our bracket onto our tail wheel wire, and we're going to use our wood screw, and we're going to screw this down. Okay. Now, after we've done that operation, let me zoom out here a little bit. After we've done that operation, we want to take our rudder and we want to flex it and make sure that it's just as easy to swing as it was before we installed the tail wheel wire and bracket. If it's difficult to swing now, if it obviously has more drag, then something went wrong with our tail wheel installation, and we need to undo this screw and we need to move the bracket until everything swings easily. We can install the rest of our tail wheel components. We'll install our tail wheel itself, and we'll install the tail wheel collar, and we're going to use our 1.5 millimeter hex driver tool. You can use one of these hex driver type tools or an Allen wrench, and we're going to put the collar on there, and we're going to tighten it down, and there you go. You have a finished tail wheel assembly that will take a lot of abuse.